Sea level is rising faster and faster. It's something that hasn't happened in thousands of years. In fact, sea level hasn't been higher than today for 100,000 years. And that's why we have trouble believing it's going to happen. But it's happening. We measure it around the world. It rises differently in different places, but the consistent picture is that sea level is rising and the rate is accelerating. This is only the tip of the iceberg.
Rising sea levels are affecting coastal communities across the globe. Among the string of barrier islands on the northern Gulf of Mexico, Alabama's beautiful Dauphin Island is on the front lines of this battle against the rising seas. The 1,200 residents of this 6 square miles of perpetually shifting sand are at a crossroads and responding to the combined effects of sea level rise and more intense storm surges that threaten the very existence of what was once an idyllic paradise. For generations, residents lived on this barrier island by taking cues from nature. They knew to build their houses and raise their families behind the protection of giant dunes in the midst of a maritime forest that sheltered them from the punishing winds and surges from storms. This is the story of the consequences of human intervention against the forces of nature, where hubris and ignorance led to the cutting down of trees, filling in of marshes, building in vulnerable areas, and the unrestrained development now threatening the island's resilience.
Dauphin Island is a laid-back, relaxed community that is not overly developed. This is a place that sort of time forgot. It's that unique, down-home, family-friendly environment that makes it a great place to live, a great place to play, and a great place to work.
I think at this particular point in time for the island, our biggest challenge is erosion specifically. We're physically losing the island, which is our town.
In 1950, Dauphin Island was a remote community with 2 small stores and a 2-room schoolhouse. Lacking a bridge, it was only accessible by a daily mail boat. Most of the men were fishermen and oystermen. They ran their catch up the bay to Mobile in gaff-rigged sailboats.
I mean, to me, it was like paradise. You hear Garden of Eden. That's what it was in a sense. You know, life was simple. Everybody knew one another. They did for one another, provided food for each other, vegetables, meat, what have you. So it was real family that cared for one another.
It was really a really great place to live. We took from the environment to live. We only took what we needed. Didn't take more, and we could use that because we had no refrigeration. Could not save it. We did salt and smoked fish. We had livestock. We had cattle, horses, pigs, and goats, and that type of thing. Before the bridge was constructed, we were in a wilderness. We had no power, no electricity, no running water. We had wood stoves. We had kerosene lights. You had to go out and cut wood because you cooked with wood. If you didn't cut wood, you didn't eat. If you didn't find a way to catch something or grow something, you still didn't eat. So we were pretty handy at making nets and fishing lines and boats. So we had to make our own boats to get to the other side.
For Dauphin Islanders, surviving the elements was a way of life. From one generation to the next, they learned to coexist with this dynamic landscape, building their homes on the more stable eastern portion of the island, nurturing the forest to ensure their protection, and leaving the more vulnerable western beaches for cattle grazing. They gained wisdom from the birds, wind, and water passing over this barrier island.
About every year we'd have controlled burning. we would burn the island just like the foresters do now, practicing good forestry practices. Now we have tremendous undergrowth in these woods. We have a serious fire hazard, and that livestock kept all that down. The goats especially, they ate everything.
I think the dunes themselves are pretty much the lifeblood of any barrier island. And I think that's true with Dauphin Island. And of course, you know, throughout the history, and I know, again, growing up and hearing my dad and my granddad talk about them, they were very protective of them. And they knew the role that they played. I've heard my dad say that, you know, if he ever got caught sliding down one of them or whatever, his dad would whip his behind, you know. So they recognized the importance of it, and so they tried to do everything they could to respect and protect what was a natural barrier.
They did not build on the dunes. They did not build on the west end because they knew better. They knew they were going to lose what they put there.
Most people was in the village area, and nobody, ever built on the west end because it was too prone to hurricanes and, whatever.
You see these birds they come in out of the Gulf. You hardly ever see them.
Frigate birds.
Yeah, frigate. They look like 6 or 7 foot wide. And in summertime, the old timers see that. Say, look at that, boy. Said it's bad weather in that Gulf. You know. And they never left the island. We started leaving after the bridge come.
Yeah, there was no way to get off.
Well, when a hurricane comes, now we have to get off the island, supposedly. The highest point of this island was my grandmother's White House. And so Mama grabbed some food, and some clothing, and we'd sit in Grandma's till the hurricane was gone. And I don't ever remember the house even shaking. It's still there.
In good weather, this close-knit, resilient community shared the island with saltwater anglers coming down from the island's neighbor to the north, Mobile. As Mobile grew, so did the desire of Mobilians to get out on the water. In 1929, Dauphin Island became home to the Alabama Deep-Sea Fishing Rodeo, where participants came to catch huge tarpon, jack crevalle, sheep's head, mahi-mahi, red drum, and much more. With each passing year, the island's popularity grew as a recreational destination for Mobile businessmen, and along with it, a growing desire to transform it into a South Sea island paradise. What happened next changed the course of the island forever. In 1954, businessmen from the Mobile Chamber of Commerce negotiated the purchase of much of the island using the construction of a bridge across the Mississippi Sound to entice islanders into accepting this new era of community growth. The traditional ecological knowledge and way of life of the islanders gave way to an era of unrestrained development and population increases.
When the island was originally subdivided in 1953, maybe the planning wasn't as well thought out as it should have been, and it was more influence being brought to play because they had to have money, and so maybe that trumped what maybe was good practices, if you will.
And then came Frederick. He was catastrophic. The 1979 Cat 4 hurricane destroyed most man-made structures along the shoreline, inland, and the bridge. Its 135-mile-per-hour winds and 8 to 12-foot storm surge devastated the island.
Hurricane Frederick, it just demolished Dauphin Island, from one end to the other.
Well, all these wonderful people are trying to help me salvage what I can. I got a whole livelihood invested here. Looks like it's all going to go down the drain, but we're going to try. We're going to try to come back.
You have no intentions of giving up on it?
Oh, I don't have any intentions of giving up.
With the installation of a new, bigger, higher bridge, development on the island surged, particularly on the west end. Small hurricane homes gave way to 5- and 6-bedroom vacation homes.
After
Frederick, for some odd reason, they thought, well, let's go in and build these houses on this west end of this island where hurricane came through and took everything out, and we'll build some houses up on the sand. And in the Bible it says, do not build your house on sand because it will crash and fall.
I'm fascinated by Dauphin Island, and I've visited many islands all around the world and visited all American islands, and amazes all of us who are looking from afar that every storm that comes by destroys a number of houses and they just come right back.
Barrier islands are dynamic features of the coast. The islanders knew this based on their traditions, observations, and experiences. Today, scientists use the long history of the geologic record to better understand how these islands were formed and how they have adapted to changes in sea levels and storm events through time.
There are 2,200 barrier islands around the whole world, making up around 10%, maybe 12% of the open ocean coastlines. Most of them are next to coastal plains, and they are bodies of sand. They're always sand. They're very dynamic, very prone to erosion or deposition, and basically they migrate as the sea level goes up.
Dauphin Island presents an interesting picture. The sediment source for the whole Alabama-Mississippi chain is from tides carrying sand from Mobile Bay. On the other hand, sand along the Gulf shore from Florida is being also transmitted up to the Mobile Bay entrance, where all this sand accumulates and is transmitted to Dauphin Island, which is really a two-island. One part stubby eastern end. This is a very ancient ridge, which became engulfed by the returning waters of the Gulf just a few thousand years ago. And it acts as a conveyor belt. On the other side of the island, down from Fishing Pier, there's a narrow zone where the island acts as a sand spit. It is expected to be cut by hurricanes and being inundated and then be rebuilt by the sufficient amount of sand that coming down the pike, so to speak, from the epicidal delta. And it's an area where probably nobody should have built anything.
Just as the frigate Bird provided a warning sign for early residents of approaching storms, emerging scientific study on climate and rising sea levels sounded the alarm of the approaching dangers to a low-lying coastal development. For years, we've seen the levels of seas slowly creep higher. Now, they are increasing at a faster rate than any time in recorded history, due to a warming climate causing seawater to expand, and melting glaciers and ice sheets adding greater volumes of water to our oceans. Many scientists are now predicting a 5 to 10 foot rise in sea levels before the end of the century. An increase of that magnitude over a span of decades would be an unparalleled catastrophe for Dauphin Island, as well as coastal communities around the globe, driving millions of people from their homes and costing cities fortunes adapting to this new landscape. Dauphin Island is already experiencing the effects of rising sea levels, with roads that regularly flood during small winter storms, and even on sunny days with king tides. As the island braces for future hurricanes with higher storm surges, ongoing research suggests the results may be even worse than one might expect.
We've always believed that real estate was the best investment because it's permanent. We now have to get used to the concept that for the first time in human recorded history, that the shoreline is going to move and that land is not all permanent, that a lot of land is going to be taken back by the sea as the ice melts.
A history of storm tracks since the 1850s gives credence to the label Hurricane Alley. By charting the paths of storms close enough to affect Dauphin Island, we see the persistent forces of nature over time remind us of the inevitability of the next. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina cut through the west end of the island, leveling houses and washing millions of tons of beach sands into Mississippi Sound, essentially moving the island toward the mainland. And yet, in spite of experience and mounting scientific evidence, the federal government, through FEMA and its flood insurance programs, enabled investors and vacation homeowners to rebuild in this sensitive West End. As many property owners and investors discovered their lots had vanished into the Gulf waves and realized their mortgages were literally underwater, new construction continued.
They just keep building. The sand disappears, and they just keep building them back and back. And if you go into the water, there are pilings from previous houses in the water. And sometimes they're waist deep, sometimes they're higher than that. They just keep doing it.
Fueled by the accelerated erosion from the hurricane, many West End property owners became more vocal about restoration. And in response, government programs funded several attempts to restore sand lost in storm. Yet when considering the tens of millions of dollars spent on these recurring costs so far, projected figures make you question the wisdom of this strategy.
The west end of Dauphin Island is probably the most vulnerable section of Barrier Island that we have in the entire Gulf of Mexico, perhaps even the United States. And the reason for that is it's incredibly low-lying, it's incredibly narrow, and therefore it is incredibly vulnerable for small-scale changes in sea level.
100 years ago, people didn't build right on the beach. In the last 50 years, we've gotten into this habit of building closer and closer to the beach, knowing we could get reasonably priced flood insurance and that FEMA would come to the rescue and so on.
Alabama and Mississippi and all of us should stand back and look into the future. Look at some of these studies that are predicting major rises in sea level, and take the long term. What's it going to cost for the next 50 years in the context of a rising sea level?
When you have a situation where on any given day you could have saltwater intrusion coming over up into the roadways and up into the sewer systems and things of that nature, that is not a good situation to have unless something is done. I think we're going to continue to see erosion. We're going to continue to see private properties being lost, homes being picked off one after the other. Eventually, and not too far in the future, we're going to probably have to shore up Bienville Boulevard.
The rate of sea level rise is accelerating, doubling every 15 or 20 years now, and the time span is shortening. And we're starting to see effects, particularly at the king tide days, the days of extreme high tides.
Either man's going to keep a hands-off approach, which is kind of what we're doing now, or we're going to intervene in some form or fashion, and either that's going to be, buying out properties, condemnations, or restoration. Some combination of those, you would think, is because leaving it go at the whim of Mother Nature, we know where that's going, and it's not going in a very positive direction.
There are three things you can do if you have an eroding shoreline. You want to hold and you want to do something about it. One is to get out of there, retreat. Two is to nourish the beach, pump up sand, or three is to build a seawall.
While many states prohibit seawalls due to their destructive nature, Alabama's regulations allow property owners to use hardened structures to protect their buildings. As well as having an ecological cost, these seawalls dramatically increase the erosion around them.
If somebody's, responsible and builds maybe 2 or 3 lots in from the beach, if you have a bulkhead or a seawall or jetty, in a house just along the flanks, that energy can then be deflected around that and actually further go inland than it normally would be able to, thus kind of creating a little bit of a moral dilemma. Should this be allowed? Should one person be protected basically at the expense of other people, their neighbors?
There is no compromise on a seawall. There is no compromise. Either you're going to put in a seawall, kiss the beach goodbye. Don't put in a seawall, then you may have to kiss the buildings goodbye. Which is more important, buildings or beaches? When you pump sand on the beach, you kill everything on the beach. Everything. Some things come back right away, other things come back years later, and sometimes the beaches don't last long enough for them to even come back.
Folks say, well, that's not permanent, you know, it's only going to wash away again. And while I won't argue that that's likely to happen, I mean, does that mean we just don't do anything? But secondarily, by putting sand on the beach, that's pretty much all we can do.
So for a barrier island coastal community in particular, but any coastal community, they have to realize that the land is going to change and the tax base will change. The more they can invest in things which will endure both sea level rise and heavier storms and rainfall, the more they'll sustain their lifespan. But nothing's forever, and we need to wake up and realize that.
You know, several cost estimates we have range anywhere from $30 to $70 million. So yeah, it's big numbers. I mean, it's quite expensive to come in and do this type of work. Now, our annual budget's about $3 million a year. So we're kind of caught in a rock and a hard place when it comes to finding solutions.
Due to the wave energy and strong currents of this area of the Gulf, beach renourishment projects can only be expected to last an average of 3 to 5 years. At $30 to $70 million per project, and with prices due to increase, the cost of stabilizing the island's vulnerable west end over the next 30 years could easily exceed $500 million.
We're used to having an event like a Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Harvey hit an area, and then expecting the government to put up between $50 billion or $200 billion to recover. But rising sea level is going to change that dramatically, because as sea level rises, it's every coastal community, and it being 4,000 cities in the world and tens of thousands of smaller communities in rural areas that all need help recovering. And over time, the combination of more powerful storms, heavier rainfall events, and then sea level rise, those three things together are going to cause a new kind of economic impact. There's not endless money to keep the beaches where we want it.
I think what needs to be considered is that cities, especially like Boston and Miami, and these cities are going to trump the funding of shoreline stabilization for the barrier island. And most people agree, at least it's more important to protect downtown Boston, which is low elevation, than it is to protect Dauphin Island. I mean, everybody would agree with that. Almost everybody. Not quite everybody.
Recognizing government assistance has its limits. Coastal communities are now retreating from vulnerable areas. A $48 million HUD grant has funded the resettlement of Isle de Jean Charles residents in Louisiana to a higher ground. In Tangier Island, Virginia, with over 75% of its landmass already underwater, hundreds of residents are becoming refugees of sea level rise. These are just two examples of how low-lying communities are facing the reality of rising seas.
Right now, we're letting Mother Nature be the one that causes retreat by actually taking property away. And again, that's not an easy solution. To ask or to condemn property or to buy out property takes money.
One of the easiest ways and most painless ways of retreating from the shoreline, in my view, is not rebuilding. Once the building is destroyed, don't allow its reconstruction. If necessary, pay for part of it. You can do that with the same money you're trying to save hold the shoreline in place. That's happened a little bit in New York and New Jersey. You know, we're seeing an inkling of this happening.
Is this inkling the beginning of buyback programs, or is its long-term price too high to fathom? This raises two questions. First, can funding be found to buy out the 155 most vulnerable Gulf front structures on the west end of the island? And second, can the town re-envision a new tax base centered around providing vacation lodging in its more stable areas? If both of these actions are taken, the town could save hundreds of millions of dollars in future renourishment, infrastructure, and other storm-related costs, while maintaining its vital tax base.
I would venture to say that 90 to 95% of the houses on what we refer to as the West End are rental properties. And those were important to us, not only from a lodging tax component and then sales taxes, but just from a tourism standpoint, so that people that want to come here have an opportunity to do so. And without those, it would affect the entire economy, particularly our small, locally owned mom and pop businesses.
And the increase of insurance prices will have a dramatic effect on home values. Flood insurance policies are typically year to year. So as those policies get rewritten and the costs go up, one is it's going to affect the value of the properties, which is starting to happen. And two is at some point the banks are going to say, well, wait a minute, maybe loaning money for 30 years secured by this piece of real estate isn't a safe bet for the banks. They're starting to ask that question now.
I look at it, you can't take the native out of me. You know, I've lived here my whole life. Yeah, I'm a mayor, but I'm a native first and foremost, and it hurts me to just sit around and see my island or our community being kind of torn apart. And that's what, you know, anybody would want to see their community or their hometown rehabilitated or protected. Nobody wants to just see things go away.
Dauphin Island is suffering the consequences of ignoring the wisdom of the past. With maritime forests cleared, dunes flattened, and shifting sand held in place with bulkheads, this barrier island's ability to withstand rising seas and more intense storm events has been severely compromised. From dune protection districts to tree ordinances, the town of Dauphin Island has begun to take steps reflecting the traditional ecological knowledge of its forefathers. As the community continues along this path, it should take heed. When early islanders saw frigate birds, they knew it was time to move to higher ground. As sea levels rise and sands shift, barrier islands everywhere are faced with this new reality. Be prepared to make tough decisions about how best to survive these rising seas, or it will only be a matter of time before Mother Nature takes her toll.
I'm gonna tell you a good one.
Okay.
I was sitting up on top of one of them pilings right there. Here comes the superintendent by. Hey! I said, yes sir, what you want? Said, you know, I know a man drowned with that thing, life jacket under his behind. I said, he did? He said, yeah. He said, his head went down, his butt come up.
We knew that a turtle would come up one time in one place, and that Daddy would mark it on the calendar. But he would dig me a hole in the sand, me and Mama, and I'd sleep till he heard the turtle coming up the beach. The thing blow and puff, you know, and huff, and it wouldn't be about 6, 7 feet from where we were sitting, the turtle started digging a nest. Now, that's interesting. They dug that nest with them 2 back feet, and they laid those eggs, and you hear say, ooh, and about 7 or 8, 9, 10 eggs fly out at one time. So when I got through laying, he put me on her back, and I'd lean over and grab where her head was at the top. I'd hold on to that till we got to the water's edge, and he'd pull me off.
I caught a many a bull minnow and cooked him on an open fire on a clothes hanger. Scaled him up, cut his little head off, clean him, put the clothes hanger right up through him, and hold him over a fire and let him roast. And we sit there and eat roasted bull minnows over an open fire.
Alabama, oh Alabama, you sure look good to me at sunrise. Alabama, oh Alabama, the morning shoreline blinks in my blue eyes. There's a woman shucking oysters, oak trees making shade, a young man from the East End, a pirogue that he made, and 7 country daughters sunbathing on the bank of that water coming in at daybreak. Alabama, oh Alabama, you sure look good to me at sunrise. Alabama, oh Alabama, the morning shoreline blinks in my blue eyes. The morning sunrise blinks in my blue eyes. Oh,